Now that we're about a week into Crucible, what builds are thriving, which builds are barely surviving, and which are well and truly dead? I think it's far too early to create a conclusive meta report. There's a lot of builds tied to Crucible passive trees that we might not see emerge for weeks, and might not see emerge in large enough numbers to know about at all based on PoE Ninja. That's going to take some super sleuthing and digging into individual profiles, assuming they're public anyway. However, if you're looking for a broad overview of what sort of builds the most people are finding the most success with, I do think now is a good time to talk about some of the winners and the losers of a Crucible patch. As usual, I'm going to start by looking at the overall meta on PoE Ninja, focusing of course on softcore trade, and then dive into a few examples of some specific builds that I want to talk about either because I think very particularly good example, or in some cases because they exhibit a major mistake. Although, to be clear, if I do mention something like that, it's not to call a specific person out. These are, after all, builds played by actual people. It's not meant to be a guide or a polished representation, just something that you can look at and really get a feel for what does it look like when you put aside all the polish, all of the perfect POBs and unrealistic numbers. And so, without further ado, let's dive into that a little bit. So here we have Week 1 for Crucible League. Interestingly, there is 0.0% unascended shadows, and Juggernaut is by far the most represented ascendancy, with two of the most popular builds, Righteous Fire Jug and Bone Shadow Jug, both being highly represented. And so, to start off with, what are the most popular builds? Righteous Fire Jug, or Righteous Fire in general, Fire Trap being largely represented by Righteous Fire, though there are a few Fire Trap elementalists. Then we've got Bone Shatter, which is surprisingly popular since people keep telling me Melee's dead, and yet Melee is the second most played build in softcore trade, which is pretty darn interesting. I think this definitely speaks to the strength of Bone Shatter now that you can get additional attack speed from your weapon via a Crucible tree. Next up, something that you might have noticed, Deadeye isn't very far behind Jug, nor is Pathfinder. That's because it's Bow League. That's right, Lightning Arrow and Artillery Ballista have had a lot of success, or if you prefer the nice smooth play it from level 1 feeling, then Toxic Rain is absolutely your go-to. Even Tornado Shot is surprisingly well represented for Week 1. Moving on down the list, we've got Hex Blast, which is again slightly surprising, though I guess Hex Blast mines didn't take that many nerfs going from 320 to 321. You've got Vortex Creeping Frost, SRS, Venom Gyre. Now, Temporal Chains might seem weird. Who's 5-linking a curse? Oh, but that's not Temporal Chains. Those are Doom Blast builds. That's going to be pretty well represented. Corrupting Fever, still very strong. Spark, also still very strong. Explosive Arrow, I mean, if you're playing SSF or Hardcore, this is still probably pretty close to number 1, maybe behind RF and Bone Shatter still. Super solid option. And another very interesting one in Frostblades. I haven't seen Frostblades this high on the meta report since I think it was around Legion League. Don't worry, more about that in just a little bit. And so, just looking at this list, what do I find out? First off, it doesn't particularly matter if a build is tanky or squishy. You've got the tankiest of the tanky boys in RF Jug, and the squishiest of the squishy with a lot of a Lightning Arrow build that have few to no defenses. But typically, most of these are builds that clear quite well. The notable exception among the list being something like Hex Blast that feels more like a dedicated bosser. Though I think in pure bossing power, it does lose to something like Ice Trap or Explosive Trap, depending on whether you actually value dying or not. And with that, let's dive in and look at some of these example by example, starting with Righteous Fire. Most are Righteous Fire Jugs, with a little bit of a minority of Inquisitor and Elementalist. For the rest, I'm going to assume that all of these builds just happen to have RF in their links by accident, rather than someone seriously playing, say, a RF Hierophant or RF Guardian. Though, who knows, I could actually be wrong on that. Now, if we sort by DPS, you'll notice something very interesting. Jugs are in fact at the top. It's often said that, oh, Elementalist has better DPS, or oh, Inquisitor has better DPS. This isn't really the case. Instead, DPS matters based on your gear and level of investment. This RF Jug is probably going to be a lot squishier than many others. As you can see, only 42,000 armor, and they're probably using Aspect of Carnage. However, one thing they definitely are doing, which others aren't, is stacking that deeps. At 12 mil DPS in the Fire Trap and another 6.3 in the Righteous Fire, for a total of around 18 mil, At that point, you're almost getting into uber boss melting levels of DPS. This very much goes to show that no matter what you're playing or expecting in a build, you can often change up those expectations with how you gear. Righteous Fire Jug can absolutely be an uber tank that's kind of slow, or it can be an absolute damage machine, as this build proves. On the other hand, my own DPS is much more modest, but my defenses are way better. This doesn't quite tell the full story. I was in the middle of experimenting with things, and if you want to know more about what exactly I'm doing and why I'm doing it, look forward to a much more polished version of my character, along with an explanation video that should be coming out within the next couple days. So if that interests you at all, do be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the upload. Maybe leave a like on the video while you're down there. On the other hand, looking at an Inquisitor, well, is it the super squishy but high DPS version? Honestly, not really. The DPS isn't that much different than a lot of the Juggernauts, though I would say it is overall squishier, at least to hits. In terms of damage over time, this should feel a lot better, especially due to the life recovery. But one thing that would give me pause when dealing with certain types of hits is Corrupted Soul. Having 50% of the damage go through your energy shield can be good to split the damage between two pools, both of which are recovering, and can also open you up to one-shots if you take a mix of physical and chaos damage, since it will actually increase the size of a hit you'd be taking, whereas normally 100% of a fizz would go to the energy shield first and your life second. That said, as long as you're aware of that and have pretty good armor, something this build is on the low side of, I'd probably want 40 or 50k before feeling comfortable with that. It is totally fine and something to do until you get an Aegis Aurora. That's another difference, by the way, between Juggernaut and Inquisitor. On Inquis, I'd still definitely go Aegis, at least as an ultimate end goal with unlimited budget, whereas on Jug, I'm perfectly happy with a +1 shield. Next up, we have Bone Shatter, Jug, and Slayer, with about a 65-35 split, and a few others mixed across some pretty weird ascendancies. I'm not really sure Gladiator's place in PoE right now, but Bonezone is definitely not where it belongs. Now that said, this is another very tanky build, and it benefits extremely well from some of the recent changes. Here we've got an Ancestral Vision, great way to cap off your elemental avoidance, assuming that you're also capping spell suppression, which it looks like the build is, and a really nice axe that I bet has a sick Crucible tree. Unfortunately, PoE Ninja doesn't currently display Crucible trees, but it's a good way to get your attack speed up, since for Bonezone, all you really care about is how fast you attack. In some cases, you don't even need a level 20 gem to get an absolutely massive amount of damage, because the faster you hit, the more damage you deal. On the other hand, here's what a Slayer looks like. You might not be able to tell the difference here, because Slayer and Jug use a very similar setup for something like Bonezone. Though the Magnate is a quite nice addition, as long as you have the strength. Right now we've got 402, which should be a lot easier to get than it previously was due to things like Crucible trees. So that's a nice thing that you should probably consider if you're playing any build that can benefit from it. Arena Challenger is also pretty good, and Precise Technique means you don't have to worry about accuracy, since you want more accuracy than life, thus you will always be accuracy capped. While not quite as tanky as a Jug, this should still feel really good, since you end up with great recovery due to Overleech from Brutal Fervor. 10% reduced damage taken while leeching is also pretty nice, and with Leech potentially being applied instantly, something that's only available due to the new Leech Masteries, I would say that this feels absolutely amazing recovery-wise and should in that regard be a lot better than the Jug, assuming nothing has enough damage to completely overwhelm your defenses and one-shot you. Next up, we have Lightning Arrow Artillery Ballista, split mostly 50-50 between Deadeye and Raider, with a few champions and a couple Pathfinders. Given how strong Pathfinder is right now, I'm kind of surprised there aren't more Pathfinders here. It's pretty much the same build that it's always been. The difference doesn't really come in how you put the build together, so much as the tools the build has available earlier on. Because now, the build gets access to +2 projectiles, one from Multishot, and one from Master Fletcher. This makes it feel much better very early on. You might not even need GMP, you can instead go for LMP or Volley, and have the full GMP effect. Now, once you've got your Deadeye Ascendancy up and running, you get 5 total arrows, 1 base, 2 from the Ascendancy, 2 from a tree, without having to run GMP, or LMP, or any MP. You could even grab some more from your bow and your quiver, giving you 6 or 7 without too much investment. which is both really interesting and it means this build is easier to play than ever. I guess, sure, the gear is still going to be somewhat expensive, especially if you want to maintain Berserk through something like Calm Spirit. However, relative to before, where I wouldn't have really advised LA as a League starter, it now feels pretty appropriate, and people have definitely had quite a bit of success with it. Sure, you might not be able to tell everything by looking at the highest level characters, but if we come down to someone who's only about level 90, you'll again see a quite high level of success, although in this case there's more Raiders than Deadeyes, probably due to the additional quality of life. Grabbing one as a random example here, we've got an Elevore, absolutely great early item, Hyri's Truth, Thunderfist, that makes sense, a pretty solid basic bow, and a pretty solid basic quiver. No fancy +1 arrows here, and okay, sure, it's going to be a super squishy ranger build. You knew what you signed up for by playing the super squishy ranger build. But if that is your thing and you like going fast, this doesn't look like a terrible time. Something that's markedly different from the way it used to be before. And number 4, we have Toxic Rain Pathfinder, a build that I haven't actually played. In the past, I always did Raider or Trickster, but should be extremely, extremely strong. This was easily one of the best League starters if you wanted to play a bow build. You could definitely do Lightning Arrow, it was a lot better than before, but you still needed to know what you're doing. Whereas for Toxic Rain, you don't really need to know what you're doing, and you'll be pretty okay. To give an example of this, I'm just going to grab a level 95 character. Someone who is happy to be back on TR, we've got the Self-Attack and the Ballista. As a note, the Self-Attack could in fact be a Caustic Arrow. Personally, that's how I prefer to clear, but there's no correct or incorrect answer, it's all down to personal preference. It's still relatively deterministic to craft a bow like this. You get the +1 gems, you get the chaos damage, both of those aren't attack rolls, so just easily slam with an Exalt, and you can multi-mod for the rest. While not quite as tanky as something like a Jug, we're not quite as squishy as the Deadeyes, and this could easily be enhanced with something like a Lightning Coil. Though, given that this build has Progenesis and Taste of Hate, I'd say they're feeling relatively tanky even as is. And Diadem, while a little bit more expensive than it used to be, isn't ultimately too bad and can still be used to easily solve mana issues. For single target, you've got to drop some Ballistae. Though, personally, I don't think Focus Ballista support is the play. I've seen this used a lot, because once you have a damage to absolutely obliterate something, it does feel really good. The problem is, the Ballista will only fire when you are attacking. It will not fire when your Mirage Archer attacks, meaning when you need the damage most, when you need to run around and dodge, it simply won't be there. So I would change this, but aside of that, looks pretty good, and it plays off of the Easy Wither from the Pathfinder Ascendancy via the reworked Nature's Reprisal. And then finally, good old Cold Dot. In the past, the skew would have been heavier towards Trickster, maybe even Occultist. Now, it's pretty heavily Elementalist. This is because, as things have changed and as the game has evolved, it's been easier and easier to get the damage you need on Elementalist, so you might as well just go for quality of life and grab some defensive nodes, plus get that juicy Elementalist AoE. One other thing that I want to call out here is around 60% of builds are using Eye of Malice. Eye of Malice is great because nearby enemies have 50% increased cold resistance. In other words, 1.5 times whatever number they have. So if you're setting them to -30, now they're at -45. And between Elementalist, Legacy of Fury, and other ways to descale cold res, trust me, most enemies are not going to be at -30. They're going to be closer to -70 or 80, which, assuming you have high enough investment, dual curse and all that, you could pretty easily put them straight into the negatives at about -100, causing them to take double damage. Now, if you were to go Occultist, I do think low life is the best way to do it. The budget option here is Prism Guardian. In the endgame, or at least later endgame, you definitely want to go Aegis Aurora instead. Whereas, if you're on an Elementalist, let's take a look at one around level 95. Here we go, Eye of Malice, Legacy of Fury. Pretty standard gear. The thing that I'd say stands out to me here is this is going to be a noticeably squishier build than a lot of the others we've looked at. Not as much as the Deadeye, but more of him a Pathfinder. Though I think there is a path to fix that, which is fixing spell suppression via a little bit more suppressed gear. Unless I'm miscalculating here, this build isn't quite suppress capped, but it is getting very close, so with a little more gear, maybe by week 2, that shouldn't be much of an issue either. Really, builds like this, I can say from personal experience, do feel squishy before your suppress cap. Once you get it, they overall feel really good in mapping. And so those are 5 builds that are doing very well in the current meta. They're in fact the most popular 5 builds. What do they all have in common? Pretty good quality of life. Some of them are very fast, but lack defenses. Others have insane defenses, but you need to scale the speed via explosions, Legacy of Fury, Death Rush, and other effects. Either way, people are having a lot of success, and it's going to be really crazy to see what Crucible trees bring. But now, before I wrap things up, I wanted to go over a few quick honorable mentions, starting with Poison SRS that's doing, unsurprisingly, as well as ever. You can still hit dot cap on it, it's still a really good build, you still get really tanky, lots of people are playing it, and lots of people are finding success. As you can see, there's lots of level 100s, most will probably be using a pretty similar setup, though it should be noted that only 58% have the Covenant, and quite a few have Tavukai, so there's a mix of regular SRS, Pop SRS, and Poison SRS all mixed together. The one thing that unites them, using Darkness Enthroned to make Abyss Jewels way better. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting to me, Explosive Arrow is much less played than I've seen it in recent leagues, which I'm kind of surprised by because it didn't really get any nerfs. It's still a super strong build, and being easier than ever, this tells me a lot of people would rather play Toxic Rain. Though, I have noticed that a few people are using the Wilmus tech, which should feel really, really good. It saves you pathing, gives you a pretty darn strong helmet, and lets you double dip by stacking cast and attack speed nodes. This is especially powerful if you're doing it on a champion rather than on an elementalist. Next up is Seismic Trap, which is the most nerfed I've seen a build in a very long time. It went from being fairly dominant, even in 320, to 56 total characters. Does it still work? Yes. Would you still play it? In my opinion, no, because the playstyle kind of feels really terrible. Remember how I said many of the most popular builds had high quality of life? This is that, but the exact opposite, so extremely low quality of life. On the other hand, if you don't value quality of life and just want to kill uber bosses, then the ZHP Ice Trappers are taking over, presenting an absolutely absurd amount of DPS with many in the 100 million plus range. Is this a fun build to play? In my opinion, no. Does this build do mapping well? No, not at all. Anything kills you. Can it delete uber bosses? Well, 286 mil, 260. Yeah, it can delete uber bosses. If that's your jam, I guess go wild. Personally, I think Explosive Trap's still better with Mahuxolotls, since you can actually get tanky on that and survive some hits. This is just kind of a throw down your traps, die, and watch the boss die as well. Effective, but really not my style. And finally, the last thing I wanted to highlight was Frostblade's Trickster, simply because Frostblade hasn't been in the spotlight for a very long time, and I'm surprised that there's over 1,165 characters on PoE Ninja that are playing it, and a lot of them are finding quite a bit of success. This could very well be a meta-breaking build to watch, and I'm very interested to see it develop in the future. Diving in a little bit, let's see what's going on. We've got some Heat Shiver abuse. Ever since it's been reworked, Heat Shiver offers a massive amount of damage, so this Frostblade is approximately double the DPS we see here. Trickster is a really good defensive ascendancy. You can stack up evasion, get a bit of energy shield, and every time you get hit, your energy shield comes back. Though here, we're not using that, interestingly. Personally, I'm surprised to see some without Ghost Dance, though there are several options that do have it. For example, this setup, which, while on the one hand low DPS, is also still pretty darn tanky, and should have plenty of damage for mapping and even pinnacle bosses. While I know this sheet DPS does seem very low, remember this is before you get damage from Heat Shiver and any additional sources such as a Tornado or possibly a Hydrosphere, though I guess Hydrosphere is still a little unreliable these days. No Tornado, unless it's part of a weapon, and a really interesting setup overall. Stacking evasion to again help with defenses. The only problem here is a big fizz hit that gets through is absolutely going to crush you. So in that regard, you'll have to position it a little carefully. Though also, you're freezing everything, so hopefully nothing gets to hit you in the first place. This is very much a mapping build, but I'd be very interested to see a higher budget, maybe a little more well-developed bossing version that has a bit of tankiness maybe through things like Fizz Taken As. I could also see Arctic Armor fitting in here nicely. And so that's a quick look at the meta for 321 as it's been shaping up so far. Right now, we're still early days. A lot of people have barely gotten off their league starter. Many people, including myself, are still on it. And so we're going to see a lot more interesting things, especially as Crucible trees become more available. Right now, it's kind of a pain to smash them together, and getting something niche takes a lot of time. I've been wanting to replace my weapon for a while, and I still keep cooking the trees. They still keep not cooperating. I'm sure I'll replace it someday. Until then, we're not going to see as many interesting builds emerge. But that said, if you like this kind of meta-analysis, maybe you want to know more about builds in Path of Exile, what's good, what people are playing, and what I'm keeping my eye on, do be sure to get subscribed, since I'm going to be uploading more meta-analyses in the very near future. And because Crucible trees offer so much diversity, I'm curious, what's the coolest thing that you've seen? Not just a concept or a node, but an actual practical build that someone's playing right now. Either something that wouldn't have been possible without a Crucible tree, or something that leverages one to be far more effective than it was before. Let me know some of those builds down in the comments below. And before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Link will be down in the description, along with some other videos that you could watch, like a recent update on my RF Jug, or some of the builds that I thought were going to be dominant in the early game of Crucible, so you can see how my recommendations stacked up against the meta. Spoiler alert, most of them are quite well represented in the current meta. Or of course, you can always go for a recommendation that's on screen right now. But with that said, thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.